the transmission seized on the 93rd mile. It was February of 1945, and Feldwebel Werner Heydrich sat in the commander's cupola of his Panther Ausführung G as the massive tank ground to a halt somewhere along a muddy road west of the Oder River. The final drive had been making grinding noises for the past 40 kilometers. Now it made no noise at all. Heydrich climbed down from the turret and stood in the freezing slush, staring at the 45-ton machine that had cost the Reich approximately 117,000 Reichsmarks to produce a sum that could have purchased nearly 200 Kübelwagens. The Panther's magnificent 75mm KWK-42 cannon, one of the finest tank guns of the war, now pointed uselessly toward a stand of birch trees. Around him, the Eastern Front was collapsing. Soviet forces were less than 80 kilometers from Berlin, and his crew would spend the next 6 hours waiting for a recovery vehicle that might never come. 3 weeks later, in circumstances that Wehrmacht records only partially documented, Heydrich would find himself behind the controls of a captured American M4A3 Sherman tank. What happened over the following days would force him to confront a truth that German propaganda had worked tirelessly to obscure: that the war had never been about superior engineering or Teutonic precision. It had always been about something far more mundane and far more decisive. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what Heydrich experienced and why it mattered, we must first understand what the Third Reich had told its soldiers about themselves and their enemies. From the moment German forces rolled across the Polish border in September of 1939, the Wehrmacht's propaganda apparatus had constructed a careful mythology around German military technology. German tanks were not merely weapons, they were symbols of national superiority, physical manifestations of the Nazi ideology of racial and cultural supremacy. The Panzerwaffe, the armoured force, embodied everything the regime claimed to represent: precision engineering, technical innovation, and the triumph of will over material circumstances. This mythology had some basis in reality. In the early years of the war, German armour had achieved remarkable successes. The Panzer III and IV had spearheaded the Blitzkrieg campaigns that conquered Poland, France, and much of the Soviet Union. German tank crews developed sophisticated combined arms tactics that emphasized speed, communication, and initiative. They were, by most accounts, exceptionally well trained. But by 1943, the nature of armoured warfare was changing. The Soviet T-34 had shocked German tank commanders with its combination of sloped armour, wide tracks, and reliable diesel engine. In response, German engineers developed a new generation of heavy tanks designed to outclass anything the Allies could field. The Panther was supposed to be the answer. Developed in response to the T-34 and rushed into production in January of 1943, the Panzerkampfwagen V Panther represented the pinnacle of German tank design philosophy. Its specifications were genuinely impressive. The main gun, the 75mm Quebk 42L-70, could penetrate 140 millimeters of armor at 500 meters, enough to destroy any Allied tank at virtually any combat range. The frontal glacis plate, 80 millimeters thick and sloped at 55 degrees, provided protection equivalent to nearly 140 millimeters of vertical armor. The Maybach HL 230 P30 engine produced 700 horsepower. On paper, the Panther was a masterpiece. German tank crews were told, repeatedly and emphatically, that they possessed the finest armoured fighting vehicle in the world. Training films emphasized the Panther's technological superiority. Propaganda newsreels showed Panthers destroying enemy tanks at ranges where return fire was ineffective. The message was clear: one Panther was worth 5 Shermans, perhaps more. German crews simply needed to have faith in their superior equipment and superior training. What the propaganda did not mention was that the Panther was a mechanical catastrophe. The tank had been rushed into production without adequate testing. The first Panthers deployed at the Battle of Kursk in July of 1943 suffered catastrophic reliability problems. Of the approximately 200 Panthers committed to the battle, Nearly half broke down before even reaching the front lines. Transmissions failed, final drives shattered, engines caught fire. The complicated suspension system, with its interleaved road wheels, became clogged with mud and ice, sometimes freezing solid overnight. These were not teething, problems that would be solved with minor adjustments. They were fundamental design flaws rooted in the tank's basic engineering. The Panther was too heavy for its transmission. The final drive, in particular, was notoriously fragile, designed for a 30-ton vehicle but installed in one that weighed 45 tons in combat configuration. German records indicate that the average Panther required a complete transmission replacement every 150 kilometers of road travel. Off-road, in combat conditions, that figure dropped considerably. Feldwebel Heydrich knew this intimately. He had already lost 2 Panthers to mechanical failure since being assigned to Panzer Brigade 106 inches September of 1944. The first had thrown a track due to a final drive failure during the retreat through France. The second had caught fire when the engine's fuel injection system malfunctioned near Aachen. Now his third Panther sat immobilized on a road in Pomerania, waiting for a recovery vehicle, while Soviet artillery ranged closer with each passing hour. But the German soldier of 1945 was expected to maintain faith in ultimate victory. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels had declared total war in his famous Sportpalast speech 2 years earlier. New wonder weapons would turn the tide: jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, and revolutionary new tank designs. The German soldier simply needed to hold on, to fight with fanatical determination, and technological salvation would arrive. What Goebbels did not explain was that Germany's industrial capacity was collapsing under the weight of Allied strategic bombing. In 1944, German factories produced approximately 5,200 Panthers, an impressive number, but far below the production targets that had been set. Each Panther required approximately 55,000 man-hours to manufacture, compared to roughly 10,000 man-hours for an American Sherman. The precision, manufacturing that made the Panther theoretically superior also made it practically irreplaceable. When a Panther's transmission failed, it often meant the loss of the entire vehicle. The Reich's petroleum situation was even more dire. By February of 1945, fuel shortages had become so severe that many armored units could not conduct basic training exercises. Tank crews sat in their vehicles waiting for fuel allocations that never came. Some units resorted to towing their tanks with horses to conserve precious gasoline for combat operations. The Luftwaffe, which had once ruled European skies, was largely grounded. This was the strategic reality that confronted Feldwebel Heydrich as he waited beside his immobilized Panther. But it was not a reality he fully understood. Like most German soldiers, Heydrich had limited access to accurate information about the war's progress. What he knew was filtered through official channels that systematically obscured the truth. He knew the Soviets were advancing. He knew Germany was under increasing pressure. But he had been trained to believe that German technological superiority and fighting spirit would ultimately prevail. It would take a captured American tank to shatter that illusion. The circumstances that led to Heydrich's encounter with the Sherman were chaotic, as most things were in the final months of the Reich. In late February of 1945, his unit was assigned to an improvised Kampfgruppe tasked with counter-attacking Soviet forces that had crossed the Oder River. The Kampfgruppe was assembled from the remnants of several shattered units, a collection of damaged tanks, exhausted crews, and Volkssturm militia with minimal training. Among the equipment allocated to this battle group were 3 captured American M4A3 Sherman tanks. These vehicles had been seized during the Battle of the Bulge 2 months earlier, when the German Ardennes offensive had briefly overrun American positions. The Verleih Wehrmacht had a long history of pressing captured equipment into service indeed. German forces used captured vehicles of every type throughout the war. But for Heydrich, who had spent years absorbing propaganda about inferior American engineering, the assignment to a Sherman crew felt almost like a demotion. His first impression of the Sherman seemed to confirm everything he had been taught. Compared to the Panther, the Sherman appeared crude. The armor was thinner, only 51 millimeters on the front glacis, and nearly vertical rather than sloped. The main gun, a 75mm M3, had significantly less penetrating power than the Panther's weapon. The tank was smaller, lighter, and apparently less sophisticated. German tankers had a nickname for it, the Tommykooker, or Tommykooker, a reference to the Sherman's reputation for catching fire when hit. American crews had their own grim terminology, Ronson, after the lighter that supposedly lit every time. Panther, Heydrich believed, was a superior weapon in virtually every measurable category. He had been trained to think in terms of armor thickness, muzzle velocity, and penetration tables. By those metrics, the Sherman was clearly inferior. One Panther should be able to destroy 5 Shermans. This was not merely propaganda, it was tactical doctrine. But Heydrich's education was about to continue. The first thing he noticed was that the Sherman started on the first try. This might seem like a trivial observation, but it was not. The Panther's Maybach engine was notoriously temperamental, particularly in cold weather. Starting a Panther in winter often required extensive preparation, warming the engine with a blowtorch, draining water from fuel lines, and nursing the starter motor through multiple attempts. The process could take 30 minutes or more. In combat conditions, with Soviet artillery falling nearby, 30 minutes was eternity. The Sherman's Ford GAA V8 engine turned over immediately. One press of the starter, and the power plant rumbled to life with a reliability that seemed almost casual. Heydrich would later describe this moment as the first crack in his ideological armor, though he did not recognize it as such at the time. He dismissed it as American luck. The second thing he noticed was the transmission. The Panther used a ZF AK 7-200 transmission, a complex 7-speed unit that required considerable skill to operate. Shifting gears demanded precise synchronization of the clutch, and the mechanism was unforgiving of errors. The final drive, as noted earlier, was notoriously fragile. German tank drivers underwent extensive training to operate the Panther's drivetrain without causing damage, training that many replacement crews in 1945 did not receive. The Sherman's transmission was simpler. It had 5 forward gears and 1 reverse, operated through a conventional manual system. But what struck Heydrich was not the simplicity, it was the durability. The Sherman's drivetrain had been designed with generous tolerances and robust components. It could absorb abuse that would destroy a Panther's transmission in hours. Over the following days, as the Kampfgruppe moved through Pomerania attempting to slow the Soviet advance, Heydrich began to observe other differences. The Sherman's suspension, a vertical volute spring system, was less sophisticated than the Panther's torsion bar arrangement, but it was also far easier to repair. A damaged road wheel on a Panther required removing the overlapping wheels from the affected station, a process that could take a full day. On a Sherman, a road wheel could be replaced in an hour. The Sherman's engine was also more accessible. The Ford GAA was mounted on a removable deck that could be lifted out of the tank as a single unit, allowing a complete engine swap in field conditions. Changing a Panther's engine required specialized recovery vehicles and depot-level facilities, resources that were increasingly unavailable to German forces. And then there was the matter of fuel consumption. The Panther's Maybach engine burned approximately 270 litres of gasoline per 100 kilometres of road travel, more off-road or in combat. The Sherman's Ford GAA consumed approximately 170 litres per 100 kilometres. In an army desperate for fuel, this difference was not merely technical, it was strategic. By the third day, the implications were becoming difficult to ignore. The Kampfgruppe had travelled approximately 140 kilometres through contested territory. Heydrich's Sherman had performed without significant mechanical problems. The engine started reliably, the transmission shifted smoothly, the tracks stayed on. Around him, German vehicles were falling out of the column with increasing frequency. Panzer IVs through tracks. A Jagdpanzer 38 suffered a transmission failure. 2 Panther tanks, both newer than Heydrich's former vehicle, broke down with final drive problems. 140 kilometres, less than 90 miles, and 2 Panthers were already lost to mechanical failure. Heydrich's Sherman kept running. The psychological impact of this experience is difficult to overstate. Heydrich had spent years in an ideological environment that emphasized German technological and cultural superiority. He had been trained to view American equipment as inferior, mass-produced, poorly designed, built by a nation of shopkeepers who lacked the engineering tradition of German industry. The Sherman was supposed to be a death trap, a coffin on tracks, a vehicle that succeeded only through overwhelming numbers. But here he was, driving through a war zone in a Sherman that started every time, that traveled without breaking down, that did not require constant maintenance and nursing. And around him, German tanks, supposedly the finest in the world, were dying of mechanical failure at a rate that suggested the propaganda had been fundamentally dishonest. What Heydrich was experiencing was the difference between two entirely different philosophies of industrial warfare. Germany had approached tank design as an engineering challenge. The goal was to build the best possible tank, the most powerful gun, the thickest armor, the most sophisticated systems. Each vehicle was to be a masterwork, capable of destroying multiple enemies. Quality would triumph over quantity. Superior technology would compensate for limited resources. America had approached tank design as a production challenge. The goal was to build a tank that could be manufactured in enormous numbers, shipped across an ocean, operated by minimally trained crews, and maintained in field conditions by ordinary mechanics. The Sherman was not designed to be the best tank. It was designed to be the best tank that could be produced by the tens of thousands. This was not a secret. American planners had made this decision, consciously, with full understanding of the trade-offs involved. The Sherman was mechanically reliable because reliability had been prioritized over performance. It was easy to manufacture because manufacturing simplicity had been prioritized over technical sophistication. It was easy to repair because repairability had been prioritized over optimization. The result was a tank that was inferior to the Panther in a one-on-one engagement, but superior in virtually every other way that mattered. American industry produced approximately 49,000 Sherman tanks during the war. Germany produced approximately 6,000 Panthers. When a Sherman was destroyed, another Sherman arrived to replace it. When a Panther's transmission failed, it often meant the permanent loss of an irreplaceable vehicle. German tankers had been taught to think in terms of kill ratios. One Panther should destroy 5 Shermans before being lost. But this calculation missed a fundamental point. The United States could afford to lose 5 Shermans for every Panther destroyed. It could afford to lose 10. The American industrial base was so vast, so productive, so insulated from enemy attack, that attrition ratios were almost irrelevant. And here was the deeper truth that Heydrich was beginning to understand. Even the kill ratio calculations were misleading, because they assumed that Panthers would be available to fight. But the Panthers were not available. They were broken down on roadsides. They were waiting for spare parts that did not exist. They were immobilized for lack of fuel. The finest tank in the world was useless if it could not reach the battlefield. By the 4th day, Heydrich's Sherman had traveled approximately 200 kilometers. The engine was still running smoothly. The transmission had not failed. The tank had required only routine maintenance, checking fluid levels, adjusting track tension, minor tasks that the crew could perform themselves. 200 kilometers. In his previous 3 Panthers combined, Heydrich had never achieved such a distance without a significant mechanical failure. The experience fundamentally altered his understanding of the war. German propaganda had framed the conflict as a contest between German quality and Allied quantity, between German engineering genius and American mass production. The implication was that Germany was fighting at a disadvantage, but a disadvantage that could be overcome through superior technology and superior will. What Heydrich was learning, sitting in the commander's seat of a Sherman tank, was that this framing was exactly backward. Quantity was not a limitation to be overcome. It was a form of quality itself, the quality that mattered most in modern industrial warfare. A tank that could be produced by the thousands was superior to a tank that could only be produced by the hundreds. A tank that could be operated by ordinary crews was superior to a tank that required specialists. A tank that could be repaired in the field was superior to a tank that required depot-level maintenance. Reliability was not a secondary characteristic, it was the primary characteristic. The Americans had not built inferior tanks because they lacked engineering skill. They had built reliable, producible tanks because they understood something that German planners had not. That modern war was not decided by individual weapons. It was decided by industrial systems. This was the irony that struck Heydrich with increasing force as his Sherman continued to operate while German vehicles fell out around him. Germany had built a tank that was superior in the ways that did not matter, and inferior in the ways that did. The fifth day brought the lesson home with brutal clarity. The Kampfgruppe had reached a small village approximately 60 kilometers southwest of Kolberg when Soviet armored reconnaissance units caught up with them. What followed was a confused engagement in fading winter light, the kind of chaotic, close-range fighting that characterized the final months of the war. Heydrich's Sherman was positioned at the village's eastern edge when 3 T-3485 tanks appeared on the road. The engagement was brief but intense. The Sherman's 75mm gun, which Heydrich had been taught to view as inadequate, proved effective enough at ranges under 500 meters. His gunner disabled one T-34 with a shot to the track assembly. A second was knocked out by a Panzerfaust fired from an adjacent building. The third withdrew. But the action that mattered occurred on the village's northern flank, where 2 Panthers had been positioned to cover the main approach road. Both Panthers were mechanically sound when the engagement began. Both were crewed by experienced tankers. Both possessed the firepower and armor to dominate any Soviet tank at combat ranges. On paper, they should have been the decisive factor in the village's defense. The first, Panther fired 3 rounds before its turret traverse mechanism failed. The electric motor that powered the turret rotation had burned out, a common problem caused by the system's inadequate cooling and the turret's excessive weight. The crew attempted to traverse the turret manually, using the hand crank, but manual traverse on a Panther was agonizingly slow. In the time it took to rotate the turret 30 degrees, a T-34 closed the distance and put a round through the thinner side armor. The second Panther suffered an even more ignominious fate. During the engagement, the driver attempted to reposition the tank to engage a flanking target. As the Panther reversed, the transmission seized. The tank lurched to a stop, half exposed from behind a stone barn. The crew bailed out moments before a Soviet round struck the engine compartment. 2 Panthers lost. Neither destroyed by enemy fire in any meaningful sense. One disabled by a component failure at the critical moment. The other immobilized by the same transmission weakness that had plagued the design since 1943. Heydrich's Sherman, meanwhile, had maneuvered throughout the engagement without mechanical difficulty. The turret traversed smoothly. The transmission shifted without complaint. When the action ended, the Sherman was fully operational. The village was abandoned that night. Soviet reinforcements were approaching in strength, and the Kampfgruppe lacked the combat power to hold the position. As the column formed up to withdraw westward, Heydrich conducted a mental inventory. Of the 7 German armored vehicles that had entered the village, 3 remained operational. Both Panthers were lost, 1 burned, 1 abandoned intact when recovery proved impossible. A Panzer IV had thrown a track during the withdrawal preparation and was destroyed by its crew. A Sturmgeschütz III had been knocked out by Soviet fire. Heydrich's Sherman was undamaged. The other captured Sherman in the Kampfgruppe had taken a hit to the suspension but remained mobile. The German tanks had been lost at a rate that suggested something was fundamentally wrong, not with the crews, not with the tactics, but with the machines themselves. The Panthers had failed, not because they were overwhelmed by superior numbers or outmaneuvered by better tactics. They had failed because critical components broke at critical moments. They had failed because they were too complicated, too delicate, too demanding for the conditions of combat. That night, as the column moved west through freezing darkness, Heydrich found himself thinking about something a maintenance officer had told him months earlier, before the retreat from France. The officer had been drunk, which perhaps explained his candor. He had said that Germany was losing the war not on the battlefield but in the factory. He had said that German industry had built weapons for a different kind of war, a short war, a war of rapid victories, a war where, Tanks would not need to travel thousands of kilometers or operate for months without depot-level maintenance. At the time, Heydrich had dismissed this as defeatism. Now, sitting in the commander's position of a Sherman tank that had traveled over 200 kilometers without mechanical failure, he was no longer certain. The Americans had built weapons for the war they were actually fighting. Over the following week, the Kampfgruppe continued its fighting withdrawal toward the Oder River. Soviet forces pressed from the east, and the column engaged in a series of rearguard actions designed to delay the advance. Heydrich's Sherman participated in 4 more engagements during this period. The tank performed reliably throughout. By the time the column reached German lines west of the Oder, the Sherman had traveled approximately 320 kilometers. The engine had consumed fuel at a steady, predictable rate. The transmission had not required adjustment. The tracks had worn evenly and remained properly tensioned. The tank had required no repairs beyond routine maintenance. 320 kilometers. Heydrich's 3 Panthers had achieved collectively perhaps 250 kilometers before mechanical failures ended their operational lives. The comparison was damning. But the full weight of the experience did not strike Heydrich until several days later, when he learned what had happened to another unit in the sector. Panzer Brigade 103 had been assigned to the same defensive operation along the Oder. The brigade possessed approximately 30 Panthers at the start of the operation, a significant armoured force by the standards of early 1945. Over the course of 2 weeks, the brigade lost 22 Panthers. Detailed records compiled after the war would show that only 7 of these losses were due to enemy action. The remaining 15 Panthers were lost to mechanical failure, transmissions, final drives, engine fires, suspension damage. More than 2/3 of the brigade's losses were self-inflicted. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. This was not an anomaly. This was the pattern. German records from the final year of the war reveal a consistent picture of mechanical catastrophe. Studies conducted by the Heereswaffenamt, the Army Ordnance Office, found that the average Panther could expect to travel between 100 and 150 kilometers before requiring major repairs. The final drive assembly had a mean distance between failures of approximately 150 kilometers. The transmission was nearly as fragile. These figures were not secrets within the German military. Maintenance officers knew. Logistics planners knew. The crews certainly knew. But the information existed in a strange parallel reality alongside the propaganda that proclaimed German technological superiority. The Wehrmacht simultaneously understood that the Panther was mechanically unreliable and maintained the official position that it was the finest tank in the world. The Sherman, by contrast, could travel nearly 2,000 kilometers before requiring major maintenance. The transmission was essentially unbreakable under normal operating conditions. The engine, while not particularly powerful, was durable and easy to service. American maintenance manuals estimated that a well-maintained Sherman could operate for 1,200 engine hours before overhaul, a figure that German tanks rarely approached. These were not marginal differences. They were order-of-magnitude differences in operational capability. The implications extended far beyond individual vehicle reliability. They shaped the entire character of armoured operations. German tank units spent enormous amounts of time and energy on maintenance and recovery. Skilled mechanics were constantly occupied with repairs. Recovery vehicles themselves, in short supply, were dedicated to retrieving broken-down tanks. Spare parts, when available at all, consumed scarce transportation capacity. The logistical burden of keeping Panthers operational was immense. American tank units, by contrast, could focus on fighting. Maintenance was routine rather than constant. Recovery operations were less frequent. Spare parts, while still necessary, were less urgently needed. The Sherman's reliability translated directly into combat availability, the percentage of tanks ready for action at any given time. Combat availability figures tell the story starkly. German armoured units in 1944 and 45 typically reported operational readiness rates between 50 and 70%, and often lower. Mechanical breakdowns, parts shortages, and fuel scarcity kept large portions of their tank strength out of action. American armored units, operating the same Sherman tanks that German propaganda mocked, routinely achieved operational readiness rates above 90%. This meant that an American tank division with 200 Shermans might have 180 tanks ready for combat. A German tank division with 100 Panthers might have 50 or 60 available. The theoretical superiority of individual German tanks was overwhelmed by the practical superiority of American availability. Heydrich did not have access to these statistics. He was a Feldwebel, not a staff officer. But he could observe the practical reality in his own experience. He could see that German tanks broke down constantly while his Sherman kept running. He could see that German units were perpetually short of operational vehicles, while American units, based on what he had observed during the Ardennes offensive, seemed to have tanks in abundance. The experience produced a kind of cognitive dissonance that was difficult to resolve. Everything Heydrich had been taught told him that the Panther was superior. It had better armor. It had a better gun. It was the product of German engineering excellence, the finest tank-building tradition in the world. The Sherman was a mass-produced American product, built by a nation of capitalists who understood nothing of military virtue. But the Sherman worked. It worked when the Panthers broke down. It worked when conditions were harsh. It worked when maintenance was difficult. It worked day after day, kilometre after kilometre, engagement after engagement. The Sherman was not superior in any of the ways that German military culture valued, but it was superior in the way that actually mattered. This realization carried implications that extended far beyond tank design. German military culture, like German political culture under National Socialism, was built on a mythology of inherent superiority. Germans were better soldiers. German weapons were better designed. German tactics were more sophisticated. German willpower was stronger. These beliefs were not merely propaganda. They were foundational assumptions that shaped planning, training, and doctrine. The experience of the war had challenged these assumptions repeatedly. The Soviet Union had not collapsed under the initial onslaught as German planners had expected. British resistance had not crumbled after the fall of France. American industrial production had reached levels that German economists had dismissed as impossible. At every turn, Germany's opponents had proven more capable than the ideology allowed. But the mythology had proven remarkably resilient. Each setback was explained as a temporary difficulty, a result of specific circumstances rather than fundamental miscalculation. The V weapons would turn the tide. The new jet aircraft would restore air superiority. The advanced tanks would sweep away Allied armor. Faith in German superiority remained even as the evidence against it mounted. For Heydrich, sitting in the commander's seat of a Sherman, the Kleiman evidence had become impossible to ignore. The Sherman was not a symbol of American inferiority. It was a symbol of a completely different approach to warfare, an approach that prioritized different values, measured success by different metrics, and ultimately proved more effective. The Americans had not built inferior tanks out of ignorance. They had built reliable, producible tanks out of strategic wisdom. Germany had tried to win the war with a small number of superior weapons. America had won the war with a vast number of adequate ones. This was not merely a difference in resources, though resources certainly mattered. It was a difference in understanding. The Americans had grasped something that German planners had not, that modern industrial warfare was a contest of systems, not of individual weapons. The side that could produce more, transport more, maintain more, and replace more would ultimately prevail. German propaganda had framed American mass production as a weakness, a sign of cultural shallowness, an inability to achieve true excellence. But mass production was not a weakness. It was a form of strength that German industry, for all its skill, could not match. The Panther was an excellent tank that Germany could not build in adequate numbers, could not fuel adequately, could not maintain in the field, and could not replace when lost. The Sherman was an adequate tank that America could build by the tens of thousands, ship across an ocean, fuel abundantly, maintain easily, and replace almost immediately. In the calculus of industrial warfare, adequacy multiplied by abundance defeated excellence, limited by scarcity. The war ended for Heydrich in late April of 1945. His Sherman had travelled over 400 kilometres by then, a distance that would have required at least 4, possibly 5 Panthers to achieve, given their mechanical failure rates. The tank had been in continuous operation for nearly 2 months. The engine was still running smoothly. The transmission had never been replaced. The only significant maintenance had been a track replacement after wear exceeded acceptable limits. The Kampfgruppe, to which Heydrich was attached, had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Fuel shortages had immobilized most remaining German vehicles. Ammunition was critically short. Soviet forces had encircled Berlin, and the Reich was collapsing. Heydrich surrendered to American forces near the Elbe River. He was processed through a prisoner of war collection point and eventually transferred to a temporary camp in what would become the American occupation zone. In the immediate aftermath, Heydrich had limited opportunity to reflect on his wartime experiences. The practicalities of captivity, food, shelter, uncertainty about the future dominated his attention. But in the months and years that followed, as he was released and attempted to rebuild a life in occupied Germany, the memory of those weeks in the Sherman remained vivid. He spoke about it occasionally, in the fragmentary way that veterans often discuss their experiences. He mentioned it in a letter to a former crewmate in 1947. He discussed it with an American occupation official who was interviewing former German soldiers about their equipment experiences. He referred to it in a brief memoir he wrote in the 1960s, portions of which were later quoted in a German armoured warfare history published in 1978. The consistency of his account across these sources suggests that the experience had genuinely affected him. What Heydrich described was not merely a mechanical comparison between two tanks. It was an ideological crisis, a moment when the physical reality of American equipment forced a confrontation with beliefs he had held since adolescence. The Sherman had not just outperformed the Panther in reliability, it had demonstrated that the entire framework through which Heydrich understood the war was false. He had been taught that German technology was superior. The Sherman proved that American technology, while different, was more effective. He had been taught that quality trumped quantity. The Sherman proved that quantity, in the context of industrial warfare, was a form of quality. He had been taught that American soldiers were soft, poorly trained, and dependent on material abundance rather than fighting spirit. His experience suggested that the American approach to warfare, prioritizing logistics, maintenance, and availability, was more sophisticated, not less. These were not easy conclusions for a German soldier of the Second World War to reach. The ideological conditioning had been thorough and prolonged, but the evidence of his own experience was difficult to dismiss. Heydrich's story was not unique. Thousands of German soldiers had similar experiences with captured Allied equipment during the war. Wehrmacht maintenance officers wrote reports praising the reliability of captured American trucks. German soldiers on the Eastern Front were often shocked by the quality and abundance of American Lend-Lease equipment used by Soviet forces. Captured jeeps and half-tracks became prized possessions. But the captured Sherman tanks were particularly significant because tanks occupied a special place in the German military imagination. The Panzerwaffe was the elite branch, the spearhead of German military power, the embodiment of everything the Wehrmacht claimed to represent. German tanks were supposed to be the best in the world. The Sherman was supposed to be inferior. The experience of actually operating Shermans revealed the gap between propaganda and reality. German tankers who operated captured Shermans consistently reported similar observations. The tanks were mechanically reliable, they were easy to maintain, the controls were straightforward. The engines started in cold weather. The transmissions did not fail. These were not the characteristics that German military culture valued: firepower, armor protection, technological sophistication. These were the metrics by which German designers judged tank quality. By those metrics, the Sherman was indeed inferior. But those metrics missed what mattered most in the actual conduct of war. A tank that could not reach the battlefield was worthless, regardless of its firepower. A tank that broke down during an engagement was a liability, regardless of its armor. A tank that required constant maintenance absorbed resources and attention that could have been devoted to fighting. The Sherman's designers had understood this. They had consciously accepted limitations in firepower and armor protection in order to achieve reliability, producibility, and maintainability. The result was a tank that was less impressive on paper but more effective in practice. German designers, operating within a different institutional and ideological context, had made different choices. They had prioritized the characteristics that German military culture valued, even when those characteristics compromised operational effectiveness. The Panther was a monument to German engineering ambition and also to German strategic miscalculation. The broader implications of this story extend far beyond armored warfare. Germany lost the Second World War for many reasons: strategic overreach, ideological blindness, the fundamental impossibility of fighting a multi-front war against powers with vastly greater resources. But the story of the Panther and the Sherman illuminates one important dimension of that defeat: the failure to understand the nature of industrial warfare. German planners had believed that quality could compensate for quantity. They had believed that superior technology could offset inferior resources. They had believed that the individual excellence of German weapons and soldiers would prove decisive. These beliefs were not entirely without foundation. In specific, tactical situations, German quality advantages could and did produce favorable outcomes. A Panther in a good defensive position could indeed destroy multiple Shermans. A well-trained German crew could indeed outperform a less experienced American crew. But tactical advantages did not translate into strategic success. The war was not decided by individual engagements. It was decided by the cumulative effect of thousands of engagements, shaped by the industrial and logistical systems that fed them. America's ability to produce nearly 50,000 Shermans mattered more than the Panther's superior gun. America's ability to ship those tanks across the Atlantic mattered more than German crew training. America's ability to fuel, maintain, and replace those tanks mattered more than the thickness of Panther armor. The German approach to warfare, seeking decisive advantage through superior quality, was essentially a gamble. It could succeed only if the war was short, if the enemy's will collapsed quickly, if industrial attrition could be avoided. When those conditions were not obtained, the approach failed. The American approach was not a gamble. It was a system designed to prevail through sustained industrial output, regardless of tactical setbacks. It could absorb losses that would cripple a quality-focused force. It could continue fighting even when individual engagements went poorly. It was, in the end, a more robust strategy. Feldwebel Werner Heydrich learned this in the most direct way possible by operating the products of both systems under combat conditions. The Panther represented everything German military culture valued. The Sherman represented everything that actually won modern wars. The irony was profound. Germany had built a tank that was superior in every way that did not matter, and inferior in every way that did. What remains striking about Heydrich's account is not his bitterness, there appears to have been little, it is his clarity. He had been forced to confront a reality that contradicted his ideological training, and he had adjusted his understanding accordingly. The Sherman had not merely outperformed the Panther, it had demonstrated a different and more effective way of thinking about warfare. In the decades after the war, this lesson would be absorbed by militaries around the world. The American approach to equipment design, prioritizing reliability, maintainability, and producibility, became standard practice. The era of the handcrafted wonder weapon, built in small numbers at enormous expense, gave way to the era of the optimized system, designed for mass production and field serviceability. The Panther was not the last of the wonder weapons. Nations would continue to build equipment that prioritized performance over practicality. But the underlying lesson of the Second World War remained, that industrial warfare rewards adequacy multiplied by abundance, not excellence limited by scarcity. Feldwebel Werner Heydrich understood this. He had driven the proof for over 400 kilometers. The morning of February 8, 1945, Heydrich had stood beside his immobilized Panther on a muddy road in Pomerania, waiting for a recovery vehicle that might never come. He had been a believer in German technological superiority, a product of years of propaganda and training. 10 weeks later, he surrendered to American forces after traveling over 400 kilometers in a Sherman tank that had never suffered a major mechanical failure. The Panther's transmission had failed after 93 miles. The Sherman had traveled 250 miles and could have traveled further still. In those miles lay the difference between two philosophies of warfare, two industrial systems, two understandings of what modern war required. Germany had built a better tank. America had built a better army. The distinction made all the difference. Thank you for watching. For more detailed, historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.